I recently made this video where I reworked the original epic scale Thunderhawk design into a larger and more detailed 3D print for Legions Imperialis. At the end of the video I made a comment about how making it at 40k scale was something I would maybe do if we ever got a filament printer, just because they're more suited to that kind of big project than the resin printer we do have. However, I have since realised that I was operating under a couple of assumptions that do not have to be the case. One, that I would need to upscale my larger revised version, and two, that it would need to be run as a Thunderhawk in-game. Because if we start to get a little bit more flexible with those, then things start getting a little bit more achievable with the tools I have access to. So consider this a part 2, or possibly the same video but from a parallel universe, or at the very least further evidence that I really cannot leave well enough alone. Let us observe the original Thunderhawk Mini. I didn't mention this in the original video, but this was sculpted by Norman Swales and came out in 1992. And by didn't mention it, I mean I hadn't yet scoured every era-appropriate White Dwarf catalogue to find that information, since it's just one of those minis that kinda fell through the cracks and didn't appear very much. Now, this thing was always too small. Its rules in the 1991 Armies of the Imperium expansion for Space Marine 2nd edition state that it could carry 6 bases of Marines, which was 30 little guys. And people say the Rhino's too small. The original Thunderhawk was about the same size as an epic Rhino, but it carried 3 times as many people. Actually, if you take away its wingspan, its main hull is thinner than a Rhino. It's just a little bit bigger in the other dimensions. And I have printed several Rhino-sized things on my resin printer. Now, if we're upscaling my revised Thunderhawk design, that thing would end up about a foot long, which would be a nightmare to do on the printer that I have. But if I do it like those third-party companies in the 90s did, and just scale up the original design, warts and all, making it about 5 times the size, what with Epic being at 6mm and 40k being at 28mm. At the time, more or less, it's complicated, we don't have time to get into it. What we'd be left with should maintain the size difference between it and a full-size Rhino that we'd expect based on the epic scale size differences. It'd be too small to realistically run it as any iteration of a 40k Thunderhawk and would look pretty basic. But I do have a Space Marine army made of Rogue Trader minis where such an aesthetic would absolutely fit in, and that army was mostly intended for use in modern editions, so I have some options as to how to run it. But we'll get back to that part later. For now, let's pull up the old Tinkercad model for my OG Thunderhawk recreation, and I think we've got a few things to do besides just, making it big. It needs to be split into separate parts as it's just too big to print as one massive and heavy chunk of resin. Well, I could, but it would be inadvisable for a lot of reasons. It also needs some details adjusting to make them work at large scale. Not much, just a few tweaks. And finally, we need to figure out how to mount it on an appropriate base. So let's start with the easy thing, making it 5 times as big. Boom, done. Then I needed to decide how to split it apart and hollow out. I could do this the same way as I did the Legions version and make the front come off, but I think this time I'll mimic the original metal mini. So the body will be one piece, the turret will be another, and the wings will be the last piece. Well, I'll actually split those into 2 bits for simplicity of printing. Once that's done, I'll hollow it out as well as add a few braces inside just to make it a little stronger. Then I'll do a quick pass to update the details. There's not much I want to do since I do want it to keep the same general vibe, but as someone who cut his teeth making orc conversions, I'm very aware of how much you can add to a mini by just adding a bunch of rivets. Some of these details come from the Armies of the Imperium book, which had this image of one where you can see some extra stuff like this ridge under the windows, so I added that as well as this little detail under the turret, which I made split into 2 so that could be hollow too. Well, okay, it didn't actually need to be 2 pieces since once I finished it I'd put a hole right through it anyway, but whatever, it's fine. One thing I did actually need to change is the side guns, since they're basically a relief of guns that would look weird at 40k scale, so I subjected them to the same sort of thing I did for the Legion scale one, but kept the basic shapes this time rather than making them into specific weapons. Finally, there's the stand. Although I could do something more authentic to the time period, I do tend to use modern basing on my Lamenter's army since I just prefer it, so I'm gonna go with one of these things, so I guess I'll just need to wait for that to be delivered. However, I do have a Stormhawk knocking around and they use those bases, so I have one now to measure rather than needing to wait for the base to arrive, which is a big plus. I'm funny. Using it, I got the size for an appropriate hole which I can put in the bottom of the Thunderhawk, and after some tweaking here and there, I think we're ready to print. So a couple of little things to mention before we go any further. This is a pretty rough and ready job I've done. This isn't something I've made for wider release, I'm only intending to make one of these for me, so if I need to do a little bit of filing and filling to make it fit together, that's fine. Secondly, I did originally think about making the front ramp be able to open, but chose not to in the end since making all that work would mean that I'd need to have some kind of interior in there. And once you've got that, you need to think about, well, how do I paint the interior? Is it a separate piece? Do I split the hull into even more pieces to make it work? It's a whole process, and it wasn't really important to what it was actually going to be used for on the tabletop, again for reasons we'll get into later. So I opted to leave the door permanently shut. I pray that you can forgive me for this. Right, off it goes to the printer, and hey, this is big enough that I can actually use the time-lapse feature on it. Neat. Less neat is... it didn't come out super great. In my experience, small-scale resin prints are relatively idiot-proof and will mostly be fine with auto-generated supports, but once it gets big, there's a lot of issues that can occur, and I do not have much experience with stuff quite this big. I'm pretty sure I know how to prevent this happening if I was to print it again, but A, I'm kind of impatient and I don't like wasting resin, and B, it does kind of fit together, and that's more than I can say for some Forge World kits I've assembled, so I think I'm going to try and make this work. I'll see you in 2 to 20 hours after a lot of filing and filling and presumably uttering a lot of other words beginning with F. Okay, that wasn't actually too bad. It was indeed a lot of filing and filling, with Milliput for the big stuff and smoothing out some of the other bits with liquid green stuff, all of which leaves it looking like an absolute mess, but it's one coherent piece now. Now to throw some primer on this and see how it looks. Once I threw primer on there, you could see a few bits that were still a bit dodgy, so I've gone over those again, but yeah, I think we're ready to paint. Again, I hate showing off my painting process, but the basic things here are as many thin coats of Avalon Sunset as I can be asked to do, wash in the recesses with Reikland Flesh Shade, then highlight with Dawn Yellow, and also do everything else, I guess. This is not a painting tutorial, leave me alone. So now I just need to wait for the base to arrive and, oh, there we go. With appropriate basing thrown on there, it is done. A 40k scale Mark I Thunderhawk. Now, yes, the style of details on this thing don't look 100% congruent with the plastic models of the time, like the Rhino, but I never really wanted it to be. What I wanted was this to look like a Lost Armor Cast miniature, although given the quality of the original print, I probably got closer to a Lost Epicast mini. Okay, even for me that was an incredibly niche joke. Anyway, Armorcast were one of those companies that, amongst other things, upscaled old Epic minis back in the 90s. We did a whole video on it if you want to learn more. And one of the quirks of those minis is that they were usually kinda basic on their details, as they often didn't add much that wasn't present on the original, much smaller minis. So they were often big and chunky and basic, just like this, which gives them a very specific charm. And yes, again, this is very small for a Thunderhawk, but also, it's kinda the only size it could be for this particular army. You could base the size on the later Thunderhawk minis, but those came out much later than the time period the army comes from, plus those are such a different design that it's not that useful anyway. You could base it on the art, but, like, the only art we have is vague about such things. We could base it on its transport capacity, but when has anything in 40k been scaled to that? No, on some level, basing it on the original Mini size, the only Thunderhawk Mini in any form available at the time 40k was in its first edition, and then scaling that up in line with the other vehicles in the line, is the closest thing to an official size there is for this specific design. Am I just inventing reasons why it's fine that this thing is a bit undersized? Perhaps, but I'm also technically correct. Still, now the question is, what the hell do I run this thing as? Well, I could stat it out for Rogue Trader, sure, or use the 3rd edition vehicle creation rules, but for the modern game, I have a plan. It's too small for a Storm Raven, which would probably be the most fitting option, but it is more or less spot on for the footprint of a Stormhawk. The guns wouldn't really line up, but they are just random tubes, so who knows what they are anyway. I mean, I know since I was just looking up their original rules, but you get what I mean. That's why I specifically got my Stormhawk out to measure the standoff. I was also measuring the Stormhawk. It's also why I didn't bother with an opening door, as it'll never be transporting anyone anyway. So what did I learn with this project? Well, I learned that I should not forget the old ways. With 3D printing, it's easy to, when something goes wrong, just print it over and over again with small tweaks until you get it right. And sure, sometimes that is a part of the process of creation, but if I'd done it here, I'd also end up with a pile of large parts I was never going to use for anything else, and that just felt a bit wasteful. However, by getting something close enough and then relying not on my new skills with 3D printing, but on the old ones I developed over the years getting minis that didn't really want to go together, I've ended up with something I'm more than happy with, and I didn't end up creating any more waste than was necessary. Which highlights that 3D printing is just one tool in the toolkit. A particularly powerful one, to be sure, but most jobs are going to require more than a single tool. Anyway, I have this thing now. It is a very silly addition to my Lamenters, and I am rather pleased with it. And I think I might have finally gotten messing around with this Mark 1 Thunderhawk design out of my system. I mean, what else is there left to do? Make a Thunderhawk transporter based on it, or go the other way and make an even smaller one for use in Battlefleet Gothic? Because I've already done both of those things and I don't think I get much from doing it again. So yes, thank you very much for watching, and let me know if there's any other old epic scale designs you'd be interested in seeing me adapt in some way. Although at present I'm thinking I might take a look at the Hellhound next. Leave it with me. Hello again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, please do all the usual stuff, liking and subscribing and all that. And if you'd like to support future videos, consider signing up for our Patreon at patreon.com/snipeandwib. Also, I wasn't going to put up the files for this thing since, as I stated in the video, it's a bit rough. And since I only ever intended to make one of them, I didn't bother refining it for future prints. But since I knew that some of you were going to ask, I have put a link right at the bottom of the description where you can find them. I just take no responsibility for how much of a hassle they may or may not be. Anyway, bye.